Let me know if you can hear me. Hello, everyone. Good morning in the Americas and good afternoon in the UK, the EU, and beyond. Welcome, everyone, to Scaling Up 2020 Virtual Live. My name is Jeff Passmore, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the 7th in our series of 8 weekly Scaling Up Live webinars. This entire series of 8 webinars is sponsored by our platinum sponsor, EcoStrat, North America's biomass supply chain experts. EcoStrat has sourced and supplied over 5 million tons of wood fiber and organic feedstock in the markets across North America. And in addition, today's webinar is hosted by Advanced Biofuels Canada, a national Canadian industry association advocating on behalf of the advanced biofuels industry. Now, I've just got a few housekeeping things to talk about. First of all, if you have a Bluetooth device connected, we recommend turning it off because you shouldn't be on Bluetooth while you're on Zoom. Also, as a registered participant, your video capabilities will be disabled and you're automatically muted. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube to all registrants following the end of today's session. Now, if you have any questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A box. Don't use the chat box for asking questions of the panelists. We'll only be moderating, the session chair will only be monitoring the question and answer box. Now, speaking of today's session, Net Zero by 2050, what role for biofuels and other non-fossil fuels? We've got a great panel here chaired by Doug Hooper, the Director of Policy and Regulation at Advanced Biofuels Canada. Our panelists include Brendan Jordan, the VP of Transportation and Fuels at Great Plains Institute, Tammy Klein, the President of Future Fuel Strategies, Ian Thomson, the President of Advanced Biofuels Canada, and Tim Reiter, Principal Engineer of Haldor Topsoe Canada Limited. If you want more detailed bios of any of our speakers or our session chair, they can be found on the Scaling Up website. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my longtime colleague and friend, our session chair, Doug Hooper. Doug, over to you and your panel.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good morning and good afternoon all, and welcome to today's session. I'm sorry that we're not able to get together in person at Scaling Up this year. It's always been a fantastic event and an opportunity to network and catch up on industry affairs. I am happy, though, that we're able to invite you all to the global headquarters of Advanced Biofuels Canada. We've never had so many people in our offices here on the west coast of Canada. Very much look forward to today's conversation. We're going to dive into a topic that is at the nexus of all the climate action debates, and now we're in the middle of a economic recovery discussion as to how to pull ourselves out of the COVID-19 pandemic eventually. Both of those topics bring us to discussing transportation fuels, and we've got an expert panel here today to walk us through what the role of biofuels and other non-fossil synthetic fuels liquid fuels can provide to helping achieve both the climate action and the economic goals. The panelists have already been introduced. The order that we're going to go in is we're going to start with Ian Thomson giving us an introduction to what's happening in Canada on the demand side for clean fuels. We'll move then to Brendan Jordan, who will help us out in understanding what's going on the US side. Over and above all the election noise, we'll also take a closer look at the regulatory and climate policies that are affecting demand for clean fuels stateside. We'll then move to Tammy Klein, who's going to give us a big picture overview in some detail of the portfolio of clean fuel options that are out there and how things are trending in terms of their market uptake and modeling of the transport fuel systems out to 2050. And then we'll take it to ground, and Tim will give us a up close look at what's really going on the refining side for renewable diesel investments and co-processing investments. It's going to be a fantastic opportunity for you to ask your questions, and as Jeff said, please put them into the Q&A box that's on my screen on this side, and I'll be able to dish them out to the panelists as we go through a Q&A, which hopefully will be the latter half of the hour. So let's dive into it. Ian, if I can ask you to lead off, please.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to Jeff and the Scaling Up gang. And I want to say just what a pleasure it is to share this virtual panel with my august colleagues. I'll take about 5 minutes to briefly profile the advanced biofuel sector in Canada. We'll look at the results of Canada's current low carbon fuel standard in BC, talk a bit about the decisions that Canada faces with regard to how it will focus on decarbonizing transportation in the decade ahead. And lastly, we will consider 4 scenarios for meeting compliance in the liquid portion of the 30 megaton proposed federal clean fuel standard. Let's next look at just a very brief scan of our industry association. Advanced Biofuels Canada is the national voice for producers, distributors, technology developers of advanced biofuels and synthetic fuel. Since 2005, we worked with provincial and federal regulators and policy staffs and other stakeholders in virtually every fuel and carbon pricing regulation in Canada. Our members take virtually every kind of bio-based and synthetic and waste-based feedstocks and use a range of technologies to produce advanced biofuels for the road transportation, aviation, marine, and freight sectors. We also have a leadership role in formal organized collaborations that have emerged for non-fossil clean fuel sector organizations and NGOs at the federal and provincial level. So that's a snapshot of our membership. You can go to advancedbiofuels.ca to see more about us. On the next slide, we will take a bit of a snapshot of what's been happening across Canada. BC, as many will know, has been home to Canada's first clean fuel standard. It's a hybrid regulation, part renewable fuel requirement, part low carbon fuel requirement. It's a bit like California and the US federal combined together. Since 2010 up to 2018, the last year of reporting, the BC LCFS has achieved over 9.2 megatons of greenhouse gas reductions. And a key takeaway from BC, in 2018, biofuels generated 82% of the compliance credits. In fact, over the whole 8 years of reporting, it's created a little over 80% of the compliance credits. California has similar levels, and certainly in the decade ahead, we expect electric vehicles, renewable natural gas, other clean fuels, which are now emerging to contribute a growing share of the credits in that space. And we believe that will allow the LCFS targets to aim for deeper reductions, which will really benefit all clean fuels. LCFS have incented biofuel producers to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels, and really notable in BC that since 2010, biodiesel's carbon intensity has dropped 83%, ethanol has dropped 45%, and renewable diesel, or HDRD, has dropped 58%. The data that we're showing here were drawn from the Biofuels in Canada report. The 2020 version was released just this Monday by Navius Research. The link is there. Really encourage you to take a look at that. The report and the accompanying open source data provide a great comprehensive dive into not just biofuels, but all fuels markets, provincial and federal, carbon pricing, and a particular relevance to the current topics of federal fuel regulations, abatement costs and fuel regulations. Just one last note about the BC LCFS is that based on the data from that, Biofuels in Canada 2020 talks about the biofuels cost impact, equivalent to $27 a year savings for an average gasoline consumer, an additional cost of $206 a year for the archetypal diesel user, a long haul truck operator, adding about 0.6% to their diesel fuel costs. In terms of abatement, negative $322 per ton from the gasoline pool and $144 a ton in the diesel pool before consideration of any ancillary benefits. The next slide just as a bit of a snapshot of the clean fuel standard, proposed standard, but a critical discussion that Canadians have been in and stakeholders of that standard, and it really gets to the point about where Canada should be focusing its efforts relative to decarbonizing transportation to 2030 and certainly beyond to a net zero future. And central to that discussion is the question about, and we've been raising awareness about that, about how you achieve long-term targets and avoid stranding investments if you overly focus on upstream emissions reductions, generally what you would call category 1 reductions in the CFS, which at most in Canada could contribute 25% reduction in the full life cycle. So if you put that another way, even if you were able to remove every ton of emissions by producing fossil fuels more efficiently or the use of technologies such as carbon capture and storage, you would still have 75% of emissions untouched because you are still combusting crude oil, or put yet another way, you can't CCS a car's tailpipe. So really, if you're going to be looking at the long term, and this is, I think, the policy guidance from that fact, it can be seen on this slide in the two of the 4 final recommendations from a 2018 initiative by Natural Resources Canada called Generation Energy. Recommendations 2 and 3 support activities that displace crude oil using electric vehicles, renewable hydrogen, biofuels, synthetic fuels, and RNG. And you'll notice that these are separate from cleaner oil and gas recommendation, and there's a reason for that. Advocates for a stringent clean fuel standard want specific rules to ensure that the regulation draws sufficiently from the clean power and renewables credit generation pools, and that the 23 megatons in the liquid fuel of the 30 megaton total in the CFS are not overweighted with upstream fossil credits. Let's go to the last slide, which is really the look ahead. And this is really going to be the domain of Tammy, and where others talk about the full range of portfolios. Just from this slide is a draft from work that we are just doing from a and we published this starting last year, the results of a global partial equilibrium modeling of the proposed clean fuel standard. And we look very closely at how markets respond to a range of signals from the clean fuel standard. We report on variables such as credit generation by pathway, feedstock demand and prices, clean fuel prices, and compliance credit market values. The 4 scenarios that you'll see on your screen here, I won't go into the assumptions of each, but I'll just briefly say that they reflect left to right. In the first 3 bars, a high category 1 upstream emissions reduction focus. Then next, a scenario that largely follows the ECC base case scenario. Third from the left, you will see a case that has high category 3 electric vehicle or RNG demand, and on the far right, a case with high category 2, AKA biofuel demand. All of these scenarios are compatible with full 2030 compliance of 23 megatons, and all see increases in some cases substantially in biofuel demand out to 2030. In the high biofuel case, ethanol and gasoline would be 13%. At a blend level, and biomass-based diesel would be 14% in diesel. And I can't help but notice, just as a reference point, on the last, on the biofuel demand scenario, that in 2019 in California, 23% of the diesel pool was renewable, and that's at almost a 10% blend rate above that which Canada needs to meet to meet a 2030 targets 12 years later than California hit 23%. So I think that's a relevant data point in contrast to claims that the CFS targets are unattainable. And I just noticed last night in a look at the data that over a third of the compliance targets in that scenario would come from renewable diesel, so or from biomass-based diesel, so a huge point. So while these results are still in draft, they show that the average abatement costs across these scenarios is significantly below the compliance fund and the clearance credit market prices that were announced by Environment Canada in June of this year. So Thanks for the opportunity to share these data, and I'll welcome any questions and discussion with my co-panelists at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Let's turn now to Brendan. If you can, I don't believe you have slides, but you can walk us through your thoughts and update from the States. Brendan?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I didn't do slides. I wanted to just keep it as quick as possible and get on with the Q&A. So I'll try and keep this quick. But for those who don't know us, the Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in Minnesota. We work nationally in the US and at the state and regional level in a number of different US states. We have done some cross-border collaboration and with mostly at the provincial level on issues related to carbon capture and storage, biofuels, and electricity markets. Our mission as an organization is to transform the energy system for economic and environmental benefit. I lead our transportation and fuels team, so work on policy to advance a variety of lower carbon fuels. A big part of how we operate as an organization is to try to build consensus and find policy solutions that can enjoy broad support across different stakeholder groups, including industry, agriculture, the nonprofit sector, and other stakeholder sectors. I was asked to talk briefly about the U.S. regulatory environment for biofuels and clean fuels. I think the main thing to focus on in that area is, the renewable fuel standard is our existing policy, main existing policy supporting biofuel demand. That is a volumetric-based policy, and it has volume-based targets for certain categories of biofuels. We have a variety of other policies at the federal and state level, including vehicle-based policies, including things like electric vehicle tax credits, grants for electric buses. We have infrastructure policy, both supporting EV-related infrastructure, biofuel-related infrastructure, including grants and tax incentives. There's also a variety of state policies. States have things like biofuel blending mandates, biofuel tax credits. And there's also, I would say, a variety of R&D based policy, which is probably a bit broader than the renewable fuel standard, but maybe not as comprehensive as it needs to be in supporting every technology that we will need when we look out to mid-century net zero targets. With respect to the RFS, again, which is the main policy, I think that it was appropriate that the first presentation focused on Canada's proposed clean fuel standard, and I would say that there's growing interest in the U.S. in thinking more along the lines of a carbon intensity based policy as opposed to a volume based policy like the renewable fuel standard. And I don't think I need to spend a lot of time explaining what a low carbon fuel standard is, but I will maybe talk a little bit about the kind of the political context and why there is growing interest for this. I actually facilitated a dialogue on behalf of the Midwestern Governors Association over a decade ago, which included 8 Midwestern states and the province of Manitoba. And there was an effort at that point to look at a Midwestern low carbon fuel standard based on what had been introduced in California at that time, but intended to find a more of a unique Midwestern approach. The short story at that time is there was a lot of suspicion of a low carbon fuel standard for a variety of reasons. And that effort kind of fizzled at that time. I think when we look today, more than 10 years later, there's a recognition that the low carbon fuel standard has really moved the market. It's been an attractive incentive for scaling up new technology, and it has been a good policy from the perspective of biofuels and other low carbon fuel sectors. And it has been a revenue generator. It's also pushed for, it has created an incentive to improve the performance and lower the carbon intensity of existing fuels. And that's why there's a renewed interest in the Midwest, and there is also a national conversation happening about low carbon fuel standard policy. You know, when I look at why this is attractive, you know, first of all, again, this can attract a portfolio approach, whereas the renewable fuel standard is really, you know, picks certain biofuels and sets volumetric targets. Not a lot of flexibility is built in for new developments in technology. You know, the clean fuel policy approach really it's very specific about specifying how carbon intensity is analyzed and evaluated, but creates an opening for a whole variety of fuels, and it creates flexibility for when, you know, perhaps we're wrong about which fuels will develop and at what time frame. So I think there's something very attractive about a technology neutral approach, a portfolio based approach, and an approach based on carbon performance. We have found that portfolio based approach is attractive because, you know, you can build a broader coalition because it does include a wide array of different fuels. It also really reflects, you know, all the science on mid-century decarbonization reflects that we need a portfolio-based approach. We have demonstrated that, you know, you can improve performance over time. We've done modeling specifically on ethanol, where if you combine, you look at conventional ethanol, include renewable natural gas as a process fuel, incorporate carbon capture and storage, incorporate agricultural conservation practices with greenhouse gas benefit, you can get to a carbon negative corn ethanol. That's just one example. Electric vehicles, if you provide a carbon intensity benefit, you reinforce electric grid decarbonization, which is positive for both the transportation and electricity sector efforts. It creates attractive financial incentives to deploy a whole variety of new technology, and also reinforces carbon removal, both through carbon capture and storage and through biogenic-based strategies. So I think I'll stop there and leave more to the discussion, but I will just end by saying our modeling has suggested a large net economic benefits from looking at clean fuel policy in the Midwest for both fuel producers and consumers. And so I think in addition to working as a technology driver, it also has the potential to be very positive for economic growth.
Excellent. Thank you, Brendan. We're going to turn now to Tammy, please, to walk us through your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thank you, Jeff, and the sponsors for doing this session and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you all and a pleasure to be with my fellow panelists. So I'm just going to go through very briefly, if you could hit the next slide, and just kind of give a big picture overview, because the question is, you know, is there room when we're talking about decarbonization and net zero for advanced biofuels, you know, and where does that happen? And in the big picture, the answer is yes. I think the IEA has stated numerous times in numerous studies that we actually can't achieve decarbonization without the proliferation of different types of advanced biofuels and advanced biofuels technologies. And I think, in fact, and it was interesting when Brendan was talking about sort of a portfolio-based approach, I think that there is an increasing realization that there's no silver bullets in transport. So I've been working in this area for 25 years or so, and there have been lots of silver bullets that have come and gone. And I think there is a little bit of more of a sobered approach to looking at the prospect of decarbonization, and that we will need a mix of fuels and technologies in transport and beyond to get us there. So you know, it's not going to be just electrification, which is always sort of given some biofuels producers sort of heart palpitations. It's really going to be sort of a mix. And so this slide just shows, you know, what that mix could look like. And by no means is it every fuel, because I left out technologies like power to X fuels or electrofuels or e-fuels, where you can you know, create drop-in fuels through an electrolysis process. That's sort of one example. But I think this is sort of our portfolio, most of it anyway. And I think the key picture here is that we're in the energy transition. This train has left the station for the world, even for the United States, which doesn't have an overarching energy vision per se, climate energy vision per se. That could change come November 3rd. But what I find is really interesting, so I work in my consultancy on all of these issues, this whole portfolio. And I was just thinking about it this morning. It's like, you know, when I get off this webinar, I'm going to go back to writing a report about hydrogen production pathways for clients of a service I have called the Future Fuels Outlook, which looks at, you know, this sort of portfolio of technologies. Last week, I was writing a report about medium duty and heavy duty electrification. Next week, I'll be writing a status report on sustainable aviation fuels. And a lot of the work that I'm doing on a consulting basis right now is actually with refiners that are looking at their options, both here and also here in the United States and also abroad. And refiners are looking at multiple solutions to deliver low carbon, no carbon, and even net negative fuels. I mean, that's really the name of the game for them. And they're looking a lot at advanced biofuels production technologies. They're watching very closely, you know, gasification producers that are beginning to scale up. They're looking at fast pyrolysis. They're looking at hydrothermal liquefaction technologies. They're looking at, you know, as HVO begins to scale up, especially in California, the hydrogen portion of that, how can they make that low or even no carbon? Can they replace natural gas with biomethane as part of that? Do they incorporate CCS? So for them, all of these fuels are on the table. And what we're really beginning to talk about is the refinery of the future. And that refinery of the future, or that fuel producer, will look different depending on their own unique characteristics, where they are in the country, and actually where they are in the world. But it will include the portfolio that you see here. Next slide, please. So electrification is very important. That's another issue I've been working on very closely, especially breaking down barriers to putting into place electrification infrastructure in the US. Electrification will grow. It will be very important, particularly in the light duty sector, particularly in the Western countries, Canada, North America, Europe. But I think, again, as I said in the beginning, it will not be a silver bullet. So these slides, or these charts, come right from IEA's World Energy Outlook. It was just released, I think, last week. And this really shows, I mean, the projection, the sales projection under their different scenarios. So the steps is sort of the policies that we have in place now. The SDS, which I think is probably the most realistic, where countries are beginning to go further than the policies that are on the books now. And they're looking at setting more progressive, more new Green Deal, which you're seeing in the EU. They're beginning to consider more far-reaching policies, and then also net zero. So whether it's passenger cars or it's medium and heavy duty trucks, and despite all of the media attention surrounding car bans, you know, for passenger cars and the advanced clean trucks rule, so requiring zero emission vehicles in some of the states here in the US and also in Europe, they have a similar rule, you can see that there still will be, the internal combustion engine. So the question is, what's going to fuel these vehicles? And I think that's where advanced biofuels and even 1G plus biofuels, I would say, these sort of super low CI ethanols that maybe are using BECS, for example, or soil carbon crediting, which I think is a really interesting feature of the Midwest Clean Fuels Standard Plan. You'll begin to see that as well. And I think those fuels could play a role as well. Next slide. The last point that I did want to make, though, is that we're talking about North America. When it comes to internal combustion engine vehicles, I think we have to take the broader and the longer view and consider, where other markets might be. In other words, maybe there's a high degree of electrification in North America, let's say in the light duty fleet, and to a certain extent, the medium and heavy duty fleet. But when we start talking about countries like in Asia, and in Africa, where fuel demand will really be growing and really be centered here in the next 25 or 30 years, and to a lesser extent, Latin America. I don't know if electrification scale up will come as easily. And I think that that's where a lot of the vehicle fleet growth, that's where it's really going to come from, is those countries, and those are new markets for products. So this shows, and this is the last slide, that low carbon fuel demand will increase. You can see that there's a bit of a difference between the steps, which is the policies that are on the books now in countries, or if countries go further and set more far-reaching progressive policies. You can see the increase. So oil will kind of level out. Coal will sort of level out, natural gas use will increase, and low carbon fuels penetration demand will increase as well. If we take a net zero, which is not included in this slide, if more countries begin to really set policies to really foster net zero, then I think that percentage will increase, or that demand will increase even more. So I'll leave it at that. And turn it back to Doug. And thanks so much for listening. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tammy. And we'll turn now to Tim, who can segue off of your comments about refiners and investment readiness to give us an update on what's happening with the North American refining community. Tim?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. That's a good lead in. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about renewable fuels. As you've heard from some of the other speakers here, regulations, subsidies have made renewable fuels profitable. We see renewable diesel, renewable jet from oils such as soy, corn, animal fats, used cooking oil, greases, etc. In the broader context, a lot of that in the US. In Canada, of course, we have this large segment of canola crop, and so we start to see canola a little more as being of interest here, just because of availability. But of course, with all this demand and people looking at so many projects, there's a lot of pressure on these different feedstocks. So that what we hear from a lot of people looking into different projects, that is, of course, their front end most important focus, because they have to, of course, have the feedstock in order for the project to make sense. We also see renewable diesel pushing ahead of biodiesel production. Of course, biodiesel production, first and foremost, first thing people think of when they think of diesel. But the process is different, and the products themselves are different. And so when we look, especially in Canada, we look at, of course, we have colder climate. We have to worry about low temperature performance, renewable diesel being a drop-in product versus have to be blended. There's lots of considerations so we see that push happening in the renewable diesel space. We also see in aviation discussion about moving on with sustainable aviation fuels. net zero from 2020 on. Also that segment, a little smaller than renewable diesel, but we definitely see interest in that area. And slowly but surely these projects are filtering their way through. And I imagine post-COVID, when at some point when air travel picks up a little bit again, that focus will be there as more jet fuels being consumed. And then we also see, as of late in the news, you see a lot of refiners exiting California, the fossil market, and replacing with renewable products. And so, you know, a lot of big oil companies looking at how to take advantage of, first of all, to meet low carbon standards, and how they can convert existing assets and make them work in this new environment. So many 2, 3, 4, I think, different announcements in the last month, and you start to see that that these refiners are cluing into this and trying to figure out how to repurpose assets. Next slide. In terms of projects, what we're seeing out there, 50 plus projects in North America at the moment. Many of the ones that are in the US are actually proceeding with the standards in place. The economics are making sense. They're going ahead. We probably see 15 to 20 different projects similar in Canada, but those projects in Canada aren't really proceeding as fast. They're kind of at the initial front end feasibility study, initial pre-feed, pre-engineering type stage, I guess, just because waiting for clarity in Canada in terms of what the low carbon fuel standard is going to look like, what are the credits going to look like, what do the economics look like as a result of that, and how do we incorporate into the existing infrastructure. So a little bit slower behind in Canada, waiting for some clarity from the government to give direction, understand what the credits mean, work the economics, and really bring that forward. So, but it's coming. A lot of the projects, combination, when we talk about renewables or co-processing. So co-processing being the processing of renewable feedstocks with fossil in combination, versus 100% renewables, which basically, again, meaning all renewables being processed, about 80%, 20%. So some of the refiners out there looking how to leverage using existing assets by co-processing with fossil in order to achieve some reduction in carbon intensity, versus building new plants, building standalone plants, and really trying to get to the point of renewable diesel production one way or another. Capacities widely vary, as little as 2,000 barrels per day, and some plants up to 60,000 barrels a day. So as you can imagine, at 60,000 barrels a day, that's a lot of renewable feedstock, and hence the pressure on the feedstock. But a very, very wide band of look from people. Standalone versus integrated into existing facilities, about 50-50. The standalone ones more of private developers, people looking places to invest their money to do these kind of projects. Again, the integrated being existing facilities, just trying to determine where to put these things. In terms of renewable diesel versus renewable jet, yeah, probably 85-90% renewable diesel. And like I said, renewable jet is there slowly but surely, a few projects here and there, it's coming along. But by far the largest focus is in renewable diesel at this point. A lot of the projects in the US right now will start up in 2022. So it's coming quick. That's not far away. Here again, not so many. The odd project looking to go ahead, but until there's more clarity. The problem in Canada that we face here is that many of these Canadian projects may take too long, and the excess capacity that's being built in the US may push into Canada, and so there may be lost opportunity. There may not be a market for these projects because there's going to be potentially more import of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel into Canada by the time we get along in these projects. So again, a lot of stakeholders out there waiting for the government to clearly give the message about, what this is going to look like, what are the credits going to look like, so people can calculate their economics and figure out what the cost of these facilities are, what the paybacks are, and is that where they want to invest their money? They want to invest their money in Canada or not? So that's kind of the look. Next slide, please. Looking ahead a little bit more into the future, a little bit more of already what Tammy's alluded to and others. Renewable natural gas from biomass. So we do see a few different projects that are going on right now. We'll see whether those come to total fruition or not. That's one space. Blue hydrogen and ammonia. So when we talk about blue technologies, basically hydrogen production, ammonia production with CCS. So lots of interest in that space at the moment. And then we see a little bit further steps, green hydrogen and ammonia, that being the use of electrolysis in order to basically do the same production and not generate the CO2. So that's kind of some of the areas that are moving ahead. In terms of advanced biofuels, again, as was alluded to, pyrolysis oils, hydrothermal liquefaction, and even algae. So there's down the road, there's some advanced biofuels that are coming. A lot of work already been done in this space. Already possible to use these advanced feedstocks to make biofuels. Just a little more development work and stuff going on with different technology providers to really come up with a feedstock that's useful and feasible and can push this forward. And the technology is ever evolving for these new renewable feedstocks. Just every quarter there's something new learned, and it pushes these things further ahead. So that was the last slide. Thanks, Doug, for the opportunity just to chat about this.
Thank you all. Interesting set of opportunities and challenges from the description that you've shared. I'm going to turn into Chris Wallace here and try and sort out the debates of the next 20 minutes that we've got to dive into some of the topic details. I'd like to start with just unpacking a little bit of the baseline for everyone. There's a couple of different carbon conversations. One of them is about combustion emissions and the framework of zero emission vehicles. They're talking about what comes out of the tailpipe. But Brendan was talking more in detail about carbon intensity and performance-based regulations, where you're looking at the full life cycle carbon intensity from well to wheel in the case of a fossil system, or farm to fuel in the case of a biogenic fuel. Does it matter whether we're talking about life cycle or combustion? Tammy, let me just ask you to give us a context of how we should be talking about carbon.
Well, I'm wondering if Brendan's more well-placed than me to actually answer, because he's had the unique experience of dealing with both sides, both the electric vehicle, the charging companies, and also the biofuel producers. I guess what I would say is pick one, because and that it needs to be, if it's going to be LCA based, then it should be LCA across the board, and if it's something else, then again it should apply also across fuels options. Otherwise, if the whole point is measuring, determining greenhouse gas reductions upon which a whole regulatory and investment structure is based, it isn't, the level playing field comes up, which I think is valid, but also, everything is real world these days. If we're going to do this, we want to achieve real world greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and the companies that are going to have to get us there need the, I guess the right or the rightest guidance to sort of get us there. So that's sort of my big picture response to that question.
Brendan, any thoughts to come back on this issue?
Well, the short answer is that policies like clean fuel standards that are based on carbon intensity and life cycle emissions also yield reductions in absolute emissions in the transportation sector. Now, where is there a lack of perfect alignment? So we've modeled, for example, in Midwestern states, if you model a 20% carbon intensity reduction from transportation fuels, that yields about a 14% total reduction in transportation greenhouse gas emissions. So, why is there not perfect alignment? Well, number one, fuel demand, total fuel demand can go up and down. And so, you could have carbon intensity go down, but fuel demand increase slightly. The other issue is that LCA captures emissions that are outside the transportation sector. That can be a good thing, right? if a transportation fuel market creates incentives for capturing and reducing emissions outside the transportation sector, that's not a bad thing, right? That's not a bad thing if we're pulling in upstream emissions reductions from agriculture, or if we're capturing emissions reductions that really should be attributed to the industrial sector related to fuel production. I mean, an emissions reduction is an emissions reduction. The atmosphere doesn't really care, where the CO2 reduction came from.
Yeah, good point. I think we're going to have to leave this one as confusion will reign for a while. In our national inventory reports, we talk about emissions, absolute emissions, and we've got carbon taxes applying to combustion emissions, not looking at life cycle, and there's lots of disparity between the different systems. But ultimately, Tammy, I think your point is valid. A ton is a ton, and we're trying to reduce the emissions wherever in the system. Another kind of baseline thought that came up in the discussion presentations was the role of the LCFS, and Brendan, you made the case for why that performance-based system has utility in enabling all technologies. But we do have sort of the genesis of the renewable fuel industry being built on top of renewable fuel standards, which give a very crisp, clear floor, if you will, to the demand signal, and that has built out production capacity and storage and distribution and blending, and able to scale the market so that the California and BC LCFS, as Ian showed us, were able to achieve their first 10-year reduction. So the question is there do we need both systems? Do we need an LCFS and an RFS? Is there a role for both, or are we transitioning and we just need one? And Ian, I'll go back to you maybe to reflect on that question.
Good question. One we hear a lot of the time. My mind goes to California, where you have the renewable identification number markets, the RIN market under the federal RFS, and you have the signal from the California low carbon fuel standard. If you and the LCFS credit prices right now are about $200 a ton. I think if you put all of the pressure for decarbonization on the LCFS credit prices, they would be really high, frankly, and I think possibly hitting levels that would be politically challenging. And so I think what happens when you have a regulation that in effect achieves the same thing, but spreads the costs across different compliance mechanisms like a RINs market and an LCFS market, it has the effect, I think, of putting more shoulders upon which to bear the actual brunt of the regulation. And there's some efficacy in that. And I think California's success in part has been based on being able to stand on the shoulders, if you will, of the RIN market. And in California, remarkably, you're also seeing real electrification, RNG growth. So I think other markets can also, other non-fossil clean fuel sectors like electrification can look at biofuels as providing the kind of the base load, if you will, to get to $200 a ton. And then they get to also share in those attractive credit prices. So I think there's a case to be made for it.
Can I make
Tim,
a comment? Oh,
so go ahead, Tammy. Yep.
sorry. I want to be careful how I say this because I'm going to get hate mail after. I'm not advocating with what I'm about to say to get rid of the RFS or anything like that. However, and I think the RFS was useful in its time, just exactly as you said, Doug, in terms of setting the conditions, setting the growth for the market upon which, clean fuel programs, including the low carbon fuel standard, have grown. However, it is a little bit like a tight sweater to me, when it's one of those tight wool sweaters that that's about maybe 2 sizes too small, and you're just kind of hamstrung. And I'll give you an example. For ethanol producers, there's a lot of interesting, innovative things that could happen. One of which is bioenergy with CCS that would bring down, carbon intensity. Another would be, crediting soil carbon retention, which I think is really it could be so beneficial for farm communities in Canada and the United States. It's a struggling sector. Let's help them, so on and so forth. Under the RFS, these people get nothing. I mean, they've got their 20%. And it's done. They generate their DC6 RINs and they're done. They don't get rewarded for that additional. They get rewarded in California. They could get rewarded in Oregon. They could get rewarded in British Columbia, eventually in Canada. But
so let me go back to the central question then. That's a good distinction between the two. Are both needed? Or do you see that the LCFS is just a bigger sweater and it's time to get rid of the old one and move on?
In my view, maybe there's a blend for both. There could be room for both. And actually, if you look at the some of the Democratic plans, reforming RFS is mentioned, and transitioning it, keeping components of that and transitioning it to a national low carbon fuel standard is in there as well. So I think there could be room to take the best of the best and really give industry, the biofuels industry and also the refining industry, a chance to sort of grow into that bigger sweater, if you will.
So Tim, let's go to you and pressure test this. Your company is close to the people making the multi-$100-million decisions to invest in one of these technologies or more. How do they view the role of the LCFS and the role of the RFS, and what do you think the final investment decision needs to see in the regulatory sense?
Yeah, and that's part of the challenges that we're seeing right now. Like I said, I mean, in the U.S., like states like California, very clear. The direction's clear. The credits, how that works, and the economics of developing a project. So that for them is very clear. In Canada, like I said, not so much as clear. Refiners obviously all interested, even independent parties interested in building these types of plants, bringing renewable fuels to the market, but really needing to understand what the economics of that turn out to be, and that's kind of where they're all sitting on the edge of their seat. So many people, like I said, in early stages of doing feasibility, doing initial engineering designs, but not quite wanting to make the full investment with the plant yet, because they don't understand what's really the return going to be on this. Because at the end of the day, it's a business too, right? And so they're trying to make sure that they're investing their dollars wisely. And are they going to invest it here? Are they going to invest it in the US? They're going to invest it in Europe. And so they're really trying to make intelligent decisions based on all the numbers that are there. They're just not there yet.
I hear you. Okay, let's go to some rapid answers if we can. We've got about 5 minutes or so left, and a number of questions to work through from the participants today. This is an interesting one, maybe to kick off. Is the person is asking about the current level of debate on energy and climate action, and whether or not it's sufficiently informed by the complexity of the options and the solutions that are there to take us to net zero. So I think the framework is how can the policy actors, these would be our political leaders, be better informed in terms of this issue. Maybe I'll start with you, Brendan, to reflect on that from the state side. Very quickly, if you could, please.
Well, that's a great question. I think policy debate can always be better informed. When I look at the proposals that are coming out at the federal level in the US from the House Select Committee on the climate crisis, looking at the Biden-Sanders unity, the Senate climate recommendations, I think, if you compare this to sort of the last moment when it looked like there might be an opening for climate policy in the US, which was 2008, there's a lot more detail in the proposals that are being put forward, and I would say it is a lot more sophisticated today. So if that's any indicator, can we be better informed? Of course.
Yeah.
But we're certainly in a better place than we were a decade ago.
Ian, how about on the Canadian side?
Yeah, I think if I had one observation from our 15 years of work is that the technology and the capacity to bring new technologies to the market and deploy them at commercial scale is ahead of where many people in the regulatory space and policy space see them to be. And I think in Canada particularly, we're considerably behind the Americans with respect to the higher levels of biofuel blending and ethanol and renewable diesel. And my California 23% of renewable content in diesel comment. So Canada's playing catch up, and I think people just the technology and the capacity is well ahead of where people believe it to be. 2.5% of renewable content in diesel is woefully low. And we could go way above that. We could go to E15 in gasoline with not a lot of effort. And so I think that's where we need to update our maps, if you will, about what's possible.
Perfect segue into a couple of questions that came in regarding the scalability of this whole enterprise. Is the biomass there to displace the volume of fuel, the energetic content that we're talking about? And what percent of the current gasoline and diesel use are we expecting to be replaced by biofuels, and I guess the rest can be taken up by synthetic fuels and electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, things like that. But let's just focus on the biomass availability and whether the system can scale. Tammy, I'll start with you, and then Tim, if you can reflect on it, because you brought it up in your comments that there's only so much fats and oils and in the system today, and the biocrudes are not fully market ready. But Tammy, we'll start with you and then go to Tim.
My short answer is I think FOGs, fats, oils, and greases, I think availability could be potentially problematic based on the number of announcements that are out there. But that doesn't mean that every HVO or renewable diesel plant will be built just because they've announced. So I think in my own analyses, like it's close. It's really close. But in terms of other types of biomass availabilities for other advanced biofuel production technologies, yeah, it's there. It's making the technology work and scaling it up. That's the big piece for some of those technologies, HTL, fast process, gasification, so on and so forth. But I'm interested to hear what Tim has to say.
Yeah, so I agree with you. The fats, oils, and greases, it is a very tight space right now, and that's the first thing we hear in a lot of these projects. And when we start looking at pyrolysis oils and the other spaces, again, the technology is actually quite well developed. We see the same sort of thing though. It's the economics around, first of all, getting those, whether it be biomass, whether it be wood type supplies, that space is tight because presently that waste wood is being used for fuel and other things in the forest industry. And so there's a value associated with that, and that value and the cost of the technology at this point really can't jump to a level where it's economic to replace a lot of fuel with it. in the future as cost structures change. Maybe that will be a change, but the technology is certainly well developed in that space.
Good news. Sounds like we're waiting on regulations and policy action. We did not get to the politics question that we'd set ourselves up to discuss. We'll leave that to the electorate to resolve for us in the coming weeks. We're at the top of the hour. I'm going to just do a quick reverse order back through the panelists to ask if you have any final comments to leave us with, and we'll give it back to Jeff at the end. Tim, if you could start us off with any final thoughts.
No, just appreciate the opportunity. No, there's lots of things going on out there in the world in the technology space and projects and that sort of thing, but time will tell where we end up, especially in Canada, whether we catch up to our southern friends or not, and really see some steel in the ground here and producing our own renewable fuels and not relying on imports or other things. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Tim. Tammy?
Well, thanks everybody again for being here. Thanks to Doug and Jeff again, and the sponsors and my fellow panelists. Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd say is, we're in the energy transition, and there's a place and a role for all of these different technologies, and we're going to need them all. And so it's going to be an interesting time over the next, I think the next 10 years are going to be what I call the push-pull, where things are going to get, technologies will get settled out, investment choices will be made, policies will or will not be set. In this country, they will be set and litigated most likely, because that's what we do. And so, but I think the overall picture is we're on a decarbonization pathway, and we're on an energy transition pathway, and all of these technologies are going to play a part.
Brendan, over to you. Thanks, Tammy.
Yeah, I think there can be a tendency sometimes to sort of look suspiciously at the other low carbon fuel technologies, whatever particular fuel technology we're interested in. Now, I think it's just important to think big and remember that there is a lot of high carbon fuel to replace, and we're not stuck with permanently stuck with things like blend limitations. So I think if we can build bigger coalitions and really think big, we can work together, work collaboratively to advance a variety of low carbon fuels.
Thank you. Good thoughts. Ian.
I'll bridge off Tammy and Brendan. I think we have a couple of things going for us in Canada. We really do have a highly collaborative coalition across the non-fossil clean fuels, and I think all of us understand that until we have a market and we have a market to compete in, it's in our best interest to collaborate to create that market. And that's been a great development in the last number of years. And then, despite 15 years of work in this space, and you can get a bit jaded some days on how slowly things move. I really am with Tammy. There's something that's moving right now. The last year, 2 years, things are finally shifting, and even Tim's participation on the panel, I think, is indicative of how the refiners are leaning in finally, not yet, moving steel, but in places like the US, things are I think we're at a tipping point, so I'm encouraged by that.
Thank you all. Jeff, back to you and the team to close us out. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Doug. And sadly, that's all the time we have for today. What a wonderful panel. And thanks, Doug, for leading the discussion. If any of the participants want to connect with any of the panelists, you see my email address there, jeff@passmoregroup.ca. So send me a note and I can do any introduction. Thanks to our overall platinum sponsor, EcoStrat, and a big thank you today for today's session host, Advanced Biofuels Canada. Thanks to you, the audience, for attending. Thanks to our technical team, Jake and Eva. And please note that next week's webinar, our last in this series, is Paris, Getting to a Green and Just Recovery. That's going to be next Tuesday, October 27th. Next week is our final Scaling Up 2020 webinar, so I hope I'll see you there. This is Jeff Passmore signing off. See you next week. Bye for now.